All right. Well, thanks for joining me today for this discussion on issues having to do with fuel stability, especially centering on diesel and diesel fuel oils. My name is Eric Bjornstead. I am the Technical Information Director here at Bell Performance in Longwood, Florida. So, we're going to talk about fuel stability issues here today. And the kinds of things that we want to talk about, we want to talk about the problems that customers see in the field that can be related to this whole issue of fuel storage stability, or the storage of excuse me, the stability of fuel in storage. We want to talk about some of the refinery processes and the fuel components that are used can influence, for better or for worse, this fuel property. We want to talk about stability characteristics of petroleum. We want to talk about the factors that influence fuel stability. We want to talk about how to predict stability in fuel. And then we're going to wind this down towards the end by considering some of the treatments and additive solutions that are available within the industry to improve fuel in this area, to improve its stability. And because we're going to talk about that, we're also going to look at how to evaluate the performance of such an additive, what recommendations we would make for testing to determine both how an additive is working, but then also whether the fuel actually needs it or not. So, with that in mind, let's get started. Let's start off by considering why fuel stability, why this is a concern for people who use fuel. Fuel, it's inevitable that over time, it gets exposed to environmental, what we call bad actors, things from the environment, from outside of the fuel that act on the fuel and cause it to have some undesirable things go on inside of it that lead to this problem. So you're looking at microbes, you're looking at water. Um, this phenomenon creates uncertainty with the people who use these fuels or rather, I should say, creates uncertainty among people who rely on the stored fuel to do. What we mean by this is, let's say that you've got an emergency management system, or a hospital, or a municipality that stores fuel for use in an emergency. They buy the fuel, they pay to store it, they pay to maintain it, and the reason that they do this is because they are going to need it at some point during an emergency. But if they know that over time that fuel is condition is going to change from viable to not so viable, well, then this creates uncertainty with them. Are they sure that it's going to work when they need it? Because if it doesn't work when they need it, then there's big problems. So they kind of have an implicit need for the fuel quality to be guaranteed to work at all times. And so this is a problem for them. And so, given that, the question is, what can they do about this problem? Well, they basically got two options here. They can either do nothing and wait, or ignore the problem and hope that it goes away, or hope that it doesn't happen to them, or they can take some proactive steps and they can try to fix it themselves. So obviously, from our standpoint, we choose option number two. And so what we're going to in this is some of the options that we would promote to these people in order to enable them to fix the problem themselves. Now, like we said, the users of stored fuel have an expectation that it's going to do what they need it to do at any point in its life. But because it goes unstable over time, you've got uncertainties that are created. And part of this uncertainty centers around the consequences of the problems that might arise. Um, this on this slide, we talk about the costs of inaction. The people who they sit and wait and they say, well, this problem is going to happen to us, or we'll deal with the problem when it happens to us. What are the costs of this? Well, the costs of this are of not addressing the problem like this are always many times greater than the preventive cost of keeping it from happening in the first place. Now, how much greater depends. Say it depends on the customer, but what we really mean by that is it depends on what context this is happening. Typically, when you have a situation like this, when an unexpected fuel problem or a fuel failure has arrived, what are some of the things that happen? Well, you get shutdowns and disruptions. By that we mean they tried to fire up a generator, or they tried to use a piece of equipment and the fuel was so bad, maybe it lost cetane value, maybe it became unstable and stratified in storage, so the engine doesn't run like it's supposed to, which means the equipment can't do what it's supposed to do, which means the job does not get done at that time. That's a shutdown and a disruption. And so with that, you get monetary costs that are associated with it. You see here monetary costs associated with lost productivity. If they were relying on a job to be done, suddenly that job can't be done, and that's lost productivity, because not only is it not done, they have to go and spend time fixing so that they can get it done. And this, of course, this is a fire that they have to prevent. Now, they didn't bank on having to do that, so there's a mental cost that's associated with putting out this fire, and a mental cost that's associated with the damage control that's going to need to be done when they have a unexpected. And what about what about emergency response scenarios? This is the big one. Based on past precedent, you can expect that there can be some emergency response failures when it comes to when it's associated with bad fuel. Look at Hurricane Sandy that hit the Northeast. Look at Hurricane Katrina, the worst natural disaster in American history. One of the things that happened in both of those events was that they had backup generators that were relied on. Louisiana, they had these generators were firing or powering bilge pumps, and pumps used to pump out water in some of those areas of New Orleans, and up to half of those generators failed in both cases. So now they can't do what they need to do, and there's a problem with that. And unfortunately, especially with respect to Katrina, there was a tragic human cost that happened with that as well. And especially with Katrina as an excellent example of this, when you can't do what you're supposed to do, and especially when it's something that the public expects to happen, well, then you've got a credibility problem here, and you have a professional acumen that starts being questioned by the people above the worker when these failures happen. And nobody wants to be in this situation. Nobody wants to have their head be on the chopping block because the equipment failed on their watch, because the fuel was bad, or because they failed to do their due diligence and make sure that the fuel was viable for when they needed it. So all of this being said, our job here, the whole reason, one of the reasons why we exist is to provide the answers and to provide the solutions so that these people who are part of our customer base, so that they have the right answers when they need it. So let's talk about options. Okay? We've established the problem, the fuel goes bad, that there's a need for this. They need to solve this problem because there's a cost that happens on multiple levels if they don't solve it. So what are the options? What kind of options do we need to consider? Well, when you're talking about stored fuel as an umbrella concept here, there are multiple types of treatments that are legitimate for preserving stored fuel quality for longer periods of time. Biocides, water absorbing treatments that remove accumulated free water. Um, there are multifunction treatments that have stability agents in them along with detergents and cetane improver. But the one that we're going to concentrate the most on are the stability treatments, the antioxidant stability treatments, which are really the single function ones that these places need the most. And so that's what we're going to spend the majority of our focus on here. Now, one other note here, these are all chemical treatments, biocides, water absorbers, multifunction detergents and cetane improvers, stability treatments. Those are all chemical fuel treatments. But sometimes when you have a situation where fuel has gone bad in a storage tank, sometimes a chemical treatment is not enough by itself. Sometimes the best solution is to pair the chemical treatment with some kind of mechanical remediation, some kind of tank cleaning or sludge removal, manually pumping out the water, filtering and polishing the asphaltenes and the petroleum sludge and the sediments that have formed in the fuel. Again, it's situation dependent, but sometimes you have to bring mechanical remediation in with chemical treatment. Just as an aside, that's one of the things that we aimed to stress when we promote the Bell Fuel and Tank Services program, the Bell FTS program. Bell FTS actually emphasizes this hybrid approach of chemical plus mechanical because sometimes that really is the best solution for somebody's situation. All right, so fuel stability treatments. We said we were going to concentrate on that. So when we're considering fuel stability treatment or treatment of stored fuel, these things, these stabilizers are absolutely essential pieces of the puzzle to protect that fuel. Now, when you talk about, what do they do? Well, it's obvious what they do. They protect stored fuel quality, but how do they do it? Well, on a general level, these work by stopping the chemical reactions that destroy the fuel quality and by stopping them at the source. What we mean by that is they stop them in the beginning so that the chain reaction does not have the ability to progress further and actually become a chain reaction. If you can, because of the nature of what a chain reaction is, if you can stop the first reaction, you'll never have any more reactions. So antioxidants aim to interrupt and stop these chain reactions from happening in the fuel, and so they protect and preserve the stability of that fuel. If these are not present in the fuel, then there's nothing to stop the precursors in the fuel from reacting with each other and from reacting with stable molecules to turn them into unstable molecules, which react with other molecules, and they start linking together and start forming large polymers, which turn into sediments and gums and peroxides, and then you eventually have darkened fuel that's unstable and stratified. That's what happens to fuel over time if it's not treated with some kind of stability treatment. That leads to the question of, why is this such a problem today? Because it is a problem. It's more of a problem today than it used to be. Well, what changed? The first thing you have to realize is that fuels are not the same as they used to be. And one of the ways that they are not the same is that they do not have anywhere near as long a life in storage as they used to be. Well, why is that? Well, the reason that is because there were a couple of big changes that were mandated that have caused the fuels of today to be chemically different than what they used to be. Change number one was the removal of the sulfur to create ultra-low sulfur diesel. Now, of course, this was done because it was done for the environment. It was done to remove the sulfur at the refinery level so that it would not go into the atmosphere and contribute to acid rain. And by and large, that was a good thing. But in order to remove the sulfur, they have to chemically treat it, they have to hydrotreat it, and this changes the molecular composition of the fuel such that it leaves it more susceptible to microbial attack, more susceptible to chemical breakdown. Second big change is that the refining industry found itself by necessity having to respond to a marketplace that was demanding more and more and more fuel. And unfortunately, they do not have concurrently increasing amounts of oil to draw that fuel from. So they had to figure out how to extract more gas and more diesel out of each barrel of crude. Well, they've been pretty successful at doing that. Um, the United States, refinery, if you group all of them together, the refineries in the United States, they turn out about 17 million barrels per day worth of crude oil products extracted from crude oil. That hasn't changed appreciably from 30 years ago. But what has changed appreciably is the fact that 30 years ago there were almost twice as many refineries. Now there's like almost half, no more than half, the refineries there were 30 years ago, but they're processing the same amount of oil. That means that they're twice as efficient. And so one of the necessary things that come out of these forces coming together and converging the way they have been is that they use cracking methods to get more gas and diesel out, but the diesel and is produced is inherently less stable because it has more double bonds. It's molecularly exactly the same, it's less stable. And so if you have diesel fuels that are made with significant amounts of fuel that come from these cracked feedstocks, well, that fuel is going to be inherently less stable in storage than the fuels of days gone by. All right, so this is a simplified schematic of a refinery. Now, the takeaway here, just by looking at this, looking at all of these things here, the takeaway here isn't that refinery schematic now know everything that there is to know about a refinery. No, the takeaway should actually be that you should be able to see that even through this extremely simplified diagram, you can see that there is a lot going on at the refinery level, a huge amount going on, because they have to, they use crude oil, they take crude oil, and they have to produce so many different kinds of products out of that crude oil. And for some of them, produce variations upon variations upon. A refinery is a wonderful example of engineering at its finest because they're able to do so many different kinds of things at such a high rate, day after day after day in order to meet the market demands. Now, what you can see is some of the important parts is first you have the distillation column. That's where the crude goes in here, and then things start to come out. The gasoline comes out, naphtha, the kerosene, and the diesel, and then gas oil. And then down here you have the residuum, which is run through a vacuum distillation unit and split apart to get asphalt and coke. Coke after being running through a coker and a hydrotreater, and then some of that gets split. And then you look at the stream here. Well, you've got regular, fresh first run diesel that comes off here, but then you've also got, if you go down at the bottom, you've got heavy that were left when this and this were taken off. The heavier stuff here gets processed here and cracked and catalytically cracked, and suddenly you get additional diesel and jet fuel and stuff like that. So you can see that there's a lot going on, and that they're not only taking off straight run products like gasoline and diesel, but then they're taking heavier products and they're splitting them apart into more of the gasoline and the diesel. So lots and lots of stuff going on here at the refinery level. Now, as you get out there, as you go out there, you will often hear different terms that are used, and so maybe it's a little useful for us to just go over a few of the important definitions here, just so that when you hear them, you'll know what people are talking about. The first definition here is coking. We mentioned that in that refinery schematic. You could see this is the coker. The coker takes residuum or residual stuff that's left over, and it does something to them, and you get coke, which is basically almost like coal. But then you've got stuff, liquid stuff that comes off this side, which can then eventually be turned into diesel fuel. So coking is extremely severe thermal cracking. Residuum, they apply high amounts of heat and pressure, and they break apart the large molecules to create smaller molecules, which is what eventually ends up as additional amounts of diesel fuel. What about hydrotreating? Well, hydrotreating is a process done here, and then also to a certain extent here. Hydrotreating is a process that's done to remove contaminants from different fuel streams, like i.e., remember what we mentioned earlier, sulfur and certain kinds of metals. The petroleum residuals are subjected to hydrotreating in order to take some of those out so that they can get more pure compounds out of that. We saw those two areas, the catalytic cracker and the hydrocracker. The catalytic cracker, of which this is what one typically like, that's where they take the heavy oils, so run heavy oils, and they run them through the catalytic cracker under high heat and pressure in the presence of a catalyst, converts them into gasoline. The hydrocracker is the same type of catalytic cracking, but it's done in the presence of hydrogen and another catalyst in order to yield light gas oils. In other words, diesel fuel and jet fuel. All right, so those are some of the areas that are important or essential to maximize the amount of these products that they need to produce. Now, here you've got components in cracked refinery fuels. Okay, refineries, we've established, they will take some of these fuel streams and they will take cracked components that have been made in other parts of the refinery, and they will blend them together in order to produce blends of these certain kinds of things. Diesel fuels here may contain fractions or portions of some of these. So they'll take parts of some of these and they'll mix them together to create more diesel fuel. Now, when they do that, there are certain consequences to the properties of that diesel fuel that they're producing. If they make it from kerosene, well, kerosene's #1 diesel, so there's not really a problem in making #2 diesel out of #1 as a part of its blend. Straight run diesel, you've got light cycle oil is sometimes used. You've got hydrocracked diesel. That typically is pretty good. Now, if they use coker distillate, the coker distillate has to be hydrotreated before it can be added into the diesel fuel to make part of it. And what they find is even if they're able to hydrotreat the coker distillate before they add it back in to make #2 diesel, the diesel that they end up with has a tendency to form sediments during storage. In other words, it's inherently less stable in storage. So, that's just an illustration that there are consequences to everything that you try to do. There is no such thing as a free lunch, so to speak. Right. So we mentioned a number of times that the use of cracked stock components yields fuels that just aren't as stable as the straight run fuels and that have a tendency to form sediments and peroxides over time. Now, typically when they were making low sulfur fuels, that wasn't really that much of a problem. The only time when they got excess in low sulfur fuels, i.e. before 2006, was if they had the presence of some kind of dissolved catalytic metal like copper. Okay. Now, nowadays, of course, the situation has changed. Nowadays, the sediments of peroxide will form pretty readily. They turn the fuel dark. They turn the fuel dark and they start to stratify. Now, just considering for a moment the issue of color, by and large is cosmetic consideration. Color is not significant for dyed fuels. Sediment content is less than a given fluor. What we mean by that is a fuel that is dark or is of a darker color, especially if it has dye already in it, like it's red dyed fuel. Of one dyed fuel that's a little bit darker red than another one, that is not in and of itself a reason of that fuel. But what you would do is do something like a sediment test on it, and you would see if that sediment content was greater than a given fluor. If it's not, then it doesn't matter what the color is. It's just a cosmetic problem. That sediment fluor. Well, you can see that if it's below 10 to 20 milligrams per liter, well, then it's not typically a problem. It's only when sediment content in the fuel goes over that amount that it starts to give problems. Now, if the fuel is used quickly, then the fuel doesn't really have that much time to form the sediment. The one exception to this is if you have a fuel that is in a storage tank and it has some amount of, let's say it has some amount of biodiesel in it, and there are some sediments and there's some things that are being formed in there that are due to microbial activity. When we say fuel is used quickly, what tends to happen is that fuel drops at a faster rate. Well, the more fuel drops you have, the more that the fuel and the fuel gets churned up because they are adding more fuel to it more often. And when that happens, if you have any kind of microbial and any kind of biomass more and more and more often, and that can actually exacerbate microbial activity and growth in that fuel. But beyond that consideration, if the fuel is used quickly, if it doesn't have a microbial problem, well then then sediment content, sediment formation is probably not going to be that big of an issue. Non-ethanol gasoline very less stability problems because it tends to be turned over pretty quickly. But with diesel fuel, what would be considered the kind of situation where diesel fuel might develop potential stability? Fuel that's only used for seasonal use, fuel that's used for standby power. We mentioned emergency management, standby generation systems. They have the biggest potentials to have problems. Fuel that to metal through its recirculation. Copper is a catalytic metal that catalyzes instability reactions. It's bad news. And fuel that tends to get stored by the military has the real stability problems. So diesel users that are planning to do long-term storage of diesel, recommendations for them. They obviously should use a stability agent, but they should also use a biocide as well. Now, we wanted to mention that because that is the recommendation, that we're not going to go into details about explaining about biocides here. As we said, that is another show, but we just wanted to mention that. So, peroxide formation, okay? We've mentioned sediment. We mentioned that if you can measure sediment and if it's below 10 to 20 milligrams per liter, then it's not considered a problem. The other side of the coin are these class of compounds called peroxides that can also be formed. Now, peroxides weren't when the Dee-Zol had the full sulfur content, when it was high sulfur diesel, that is before the 1990s, peroxides were not a problem in the fuel. That's probably why high sulfur diesel from the 50s and the 60s lasted forever, because it didn't form things like peroxides. Once they started taking the sulfur out, first low sulfur diesel, but then to make ultra low diesel, you had the formation of peroxides, and peroxides are pretty bad for fuel quality. So ultra low sulfur diesels have the greatest potential for peroxide formation, right? Now, one thing to remember is that you can have sediment formation on one hand, and you can have peroxide formation on the other hand. You can have one or you can have the other, but they do not tend to occur in the same fuel. Now, the to this is, well, we don't want either of them, and that is true. You do not want either of them, but that's just something to make a mental note of. You can have sediment, you can have peroxide. You both have in the same fuel at the same time. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why peroxides are so concerning, they filters, they do some of the same things that sediments do, which are bad. But one thing that peroxides do that sediments do not do is they can degrade elastomers, especially certain kinds of rubber, and that you want to have happen. So, what do you do about it? What's the solution? Well, as you can see by the bold point at the bottom, you can prevent peroxide formation simply by adding a good fuel stabilization package. And a good fuel stabilization package, which typically will have 4 or 5 different kinds of components in it, one of those components will be an anti-peroxidal, something that inhibits peroxide formation. And you don't need all that much of it. You can need as little as 5 ppm in the finished fuel, and that's not very much at all. That's like 1 to 200,000. So even within the context of being one of the 5 components of the overall package, you don't need that much anti-peroxidal in a stability package in order to protect the fuel from these damaging peroxides. All right, so we talked about sediment formation. We talked about peroxide formation. The question that might come to mind now is, how can you measure the stability of a fuel? Well, let's talk about that a little bit here. There are a number of different tests that you can do to measure fuel stability. As you can see down here, you've got something called an overpressure test. The one that's the gold standard is the stability test, or what they call the accelerated stability test. Accelerated stability test, which I believe is defined by ASTM D2274. It seems to be the most reliable predictive tool for measuring how long you would expect a fuel to stay stable in storage. Now, the reason why it's called accelerated stability is because you're going to take fuel that is not unstable. Well, it might already be stable, but if it's in a stable, whether it's fresh or whether it's unstable and it's in the middle of breaking apart, it is what it is in that moment. What you're trying to do is you're trying to answer the question, how much longer will it be before it just completely goes bad to the extent that I have to do something about it? So that's what we mean when we say it's a predictive tool. And it is the only way to predict additive effectiveness as well. because unlike some kinds of tests, you can take one fuel sample, you can run an accelerated stability test on, and maybe you'll get a 30 days left, or however you're going to interpret that. You can then add a stability agent and then run the test again, and then maybe it says, oh, now you get 180 days or whatever it is. So it does have the ability to be a predictive tool of additive effectiveness. And as such, accelerated stability tests are the only ones that are currently cited in the official specifications. Now, you've also got this thing called thermal stability. It's assessed by a little bit different tests. There's a couple of tests that can assess it, the D6468 test, or there is what's called an F21 test. Thermal stability isn't necessarily a predictive measure. It's really more of a present day measurement of stability at that of the fuel at that time relative to temperature. Okay. Now, one thing that you should realize is that there is a relationship between the use of cetane improvers and thermal stability. As you can see in that second point, if you use a lot for specifically or 2-EHN, that is an acronym that means 2-ethyl hexyl nitrate. It's a cetane improver that's performances supertane. Sometimes that can affect or degrade the thermal stability of some fuels. Now that in and of itself would seem to be a problem, but the solution to this, the fortunate fact of the matter, is that all you need to do is add a little bit of stability treatment alongside your use of the cetane improver, and you will eliminate this problem. And it doesn't take, we say a little bit because it doesn't take very much, but that's just something to keep in mind. Now, stabilizers, as with many things, stabilizers work if they are used, added before credits start to form in those fuels. You need to add a stabilizer when the fuel is fresh, right? That means you can't has already started to break apart and expect it to reverse that process. It doesn't work that way. So stabilizers need to be added at the beginning. So do any other kinds of stabilizing components. Dispersants. You need to add those prior to the formation of sediment, so that when do form, it will be able to keep those apart. Antiperoxidals, you need to add those at the beginning as well. So the big rule of thumb with stabilizers is that they must be added before the fuel has started to go bad. If you do that, then you will get exactly what you expect out of those stabilizers. Now, all of this has been conceptual. We've covered a lot of stuff. Now we want to talk practical. By practical, we mean, what does Bell Performance offer to solve this problem? Well, our stabilization package is Dee-Zol Life. The base product, the base formulation, has a 1 to 2,000 treat ratio. We do have a higher concentration one, which we sell for large-scale stability protection. It's not something that is available in consumer packaging. It's available only in drums and totes, those kind of larger sizes. It has a higher treat ratio, like 1 to 5,000. Now, the key thing to remember about Dee-Zol Life is that it contains a combination. It contains 5 different ingredients which target the different avenues of instability. Remember, we talked about antioxidants, we talked about antiperoxidals, we talked about dispersants, we talked about there are metal deactivators as well. So it contains a combination of ingredients that address and neutralize the different pathways that fuel takes when it's going when it's traveling along the path towards instability, so to speak. And that's what makes Dee-Zol Life really, really effective at stabilizing fuel. Now, we said that the best practice is to add a stabilizer like Dee-Zol Life before the fuel starts going bad. Now, we will walk that back a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit, and show you a chart that a testing when there were samples of fuel that came from the terminal, and they were subjected to this test called the base fuel pad test. That's a kind of measurement that's used during the F21 test. Basically, what they were trying to do, what you need to know about what you're seeing here is that they were trying to see if they added it to fuel that was, let's say, less than perfect, would it have any benefit? If you added it when the fuel had already started to go down, so to speak, did seem to add some value. And what this evidence seemed to suggest is that the fuel went from here to here, and that's good. Higher is better, right? So there does seem to be some evidence that the late addition of a stabilizer like Dee-Zol Life will provide some kind of benefit. However, that being said, that's not enough for us to then incorporate that as a best practice to start going out into the marketplace and saying, well, now your fuel's bad, oh, just add Dee-Zol Life and it will be good as new. So this is just a point of information, so to speak. This is not licensed to go out and start marketing Dee-Zol Life as something that's going to reverse, fuel instability. But there does seem there's solid evidence that does seem to be at least some kind of benefit. So, what have we learned today in this discussion? Well, among the many things that we learned, everybody, both large customers and small customers, they're all concerned about fuel stability because it affects them all in different ways. And we should have learned that there are effective stability treatments, that the better ones use a combination of things that keep the fuel from stratifying. Now, the thing that we have not covered in this, and it's why we're leaving this to the end, the one thing that we have not covered is how long will it work? How well does it work, or how much longer will it give me for my fuel? The base answer that we usually give is you'll get at least twice. Now, we tend to basically, this kind of question is situation dependent, right? Just like, what kind of fuel mileage can I get? Well, you have to take into account that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things that may affect fuel mileage. And there are certain things like environmental storage conditions that affect storage stability of fuel. So these, when somebody says, how much longer can I expect to get? We can't just default to, oh, well, it depends on this, it depends on that, because it doesn't, a consumer wants an answer, and we need to give them some kind of answer. So as a generalization, what we will typically say is, well, you should be able to at least double the storage life of your fuel. And that tends to be an answer that is satisfactory for most people. Okay, so if you've made it this far, you now know a lot more about diesel fuel stability issues than you did when you started. So if you have any questions about this, I have my email up here, ebjornstad@bellperformance.net. You can email me some questions. Just let me know that you were watching the diesel fuel stability training. If you have some questions, be happy to answer them. So that concludes our presentation for today. Thanks for sticking around while we learned about diesel fuel stability. I'm Eric Bjornstad with Bell Performance, and we'll see you next time. Bye.